Earlier today, the government announced a £500 million subsidy package for the Port Talbot-based Tata Steel, hailing the agreement as a new and improved deal for the company. The money will go towards funding a greener electric furnace in place of the current blast furnace, which will be closed. This closure will lead to around 2,500 workers being made redundant in the short term and up to 300 more expected to lose their jobs later. The new technology will not be able to make new steel. Rather, it will melt down and refashion scrap steel and iron. The Tata Steel crisis set alight 5 years ago when the company, a huge employer and manufacturer in both Wales and the northeast of England, announced plans to sell its UK business, leading bosses and many political representatives to lobby for a buyout to save the company, culminating in the £500 million payout that we have seen today. But why was this crisis ever able to happen in the first place? Well, the answer is quite simple. Years of escalating interventionist and stifling green and environmental regulations being imposed upon manufacturers has hindered Britain's ability to make things, to be energy self-sufficient and economical. In the House of Commons, Reform UK Deputy Leader Richard Tice raised this issue.
The truth is, and the country needs to know this, that the thousands of jobs and the loss of these blast furnaces announced today is because of both main parties' obsession with net zero. Blast furnaces have been losing money because of high energy costs caused by the very expensive renewable energy.
To which the Minister Jonathan Reynolds responded,
I have to tell the honourable member that I'm afraid he's misinformed as to what this is. There are issues around the competitive cost of industrial electricity in the UK. They are, in many ways, they are not the issues the honourable member is saying.
Labour is in denial. It is more devoted to sacrificing jobs on the altar of net zero than it is to ensuring economic prosperity. In Britain, along with the EU, we have adopted the most aggressive green agenda and policies in the world, and the damage we are doing to our economies has been significant. The potential for further economic damage is catastrophic. A groundbreaking report from former European Central Bank chief Mario Draghi, published this week, has issued stark warnings on the potential future of productivity within Europe if investment in manufacturing is not prioritised with urgency. Mr. Draghi warned European leaders that they would be forced to choose between climate, economic and foreign policy goals if the EU fails to drive forward productivity. In Britain, we must also heed these warnings. Manufacturing is an essential component of economic prosperity, and protecting inefficient, high-cost energy manufacturing, carbon border adjustment mechanism tariffs, which will make goods more and more expensive and add to our economic inefficiency. In truth, the incompatibility of the radical green agenda and prosperity and happiness has never been clearer. It is absolute folly. We are losing jobs because of a green obsession, because we put imposts on energy, which we then pay taxpayers money to countermand through subsidies. It is industrial policy stood on its head. As ever, let me know your views by email, mailmog@gbnews.com. Now, I'm particularly pleased to be joined this evening by former Conservative MP Sir John Redwood and somebody who understands these issues better than almost anybody else. John, thank you so much for coming in. I was briefly Energy Secretary and Business Secretary and was dealing with this issue with Tata and indeed with China Steel and Scunthorpe. And it was the most infuriating thing that the Treasury puts charges on energy, which then mean BEIS and its successor goes to the Treasury to ask for subsidies to make up for the charges that are bankrupting the industries that we're then subsidising.
And you still lose the jobs and you lose the basic capacity. I mean, you're absolutely right. Very powerful statement you just made. I fully endorse everything you said. And I know you were challenging it when you were briefly in that department. It's a pity they didn't let you do the job for longer and get it sorted out. But what we have today is Labour pretending they've renegotiated a deal which is just as bad as the Conservative one on its principles. It means the end of blast furnace steelmaking, basic steelmaking in South Wales. They will follow that up with an even worse deal on Scunthorpe, and then this country won't be able to make any new steel at all, the only serious advanced country that can't. Thousands of jobs going, and no hope of getting that industry back. It's a disgrace.
Now, I suppose you could argue that this type of manufacturing can be more cheaply done in other parts of the world, and that we are an open global economy, And if there is a competitive advantage in making steel in China, we should import from them. Do you accept that argument?
No, I don't, because if you look at the cost structures of steel, it's practically all energy cost and capital cost. It's not people. Modern steel works don't have anything like the same number of people as they had before. And our problem is not the labour cost. Our problem is the massive expenditure on energy, which is to a great extent caused by both rigged high prices to help renewables and by all the extra taxes and carbon trading and carbon costs imposed on top. And that is what Draghi has made very clear, because we've got very similar systems to the European one. Until recently, ours was entirely the European one. And if anything, we've made it worse rather than better, and we should be reforming it. And Draghi says this is killing industry. All the heavy energy industries in Europe are at threat and risk of this kind of closure. And he is desperately pleading with them. But of course, he's part of the problem, because he favoured all this green investment and making green investment the cornerstone of the EU policy.
And indeed, that's the argument of the Labour government, which, as I understand it, is that we should be at the forefront of green investment, we should lead by example, and that the future opportunity for our economy is as a green leading economy, and Europe proposing the same. What chance do you think there is of that happening?
Well, very little, because yes, it will create quite a lot of jobs, but in China has played a blinder, and she's got far ahead of Europe and of America. And she is the producer of the solar panels and a lot of the wind turbines and certainly of the batteries, and she's got access to a lot of the raw materials and smelts and makes a lot of the raw materials you need for green products. And so again, Draghi makes this very cruel choice very clear in his document, where he basically says, if we want to accelerate to net zero, we've got to import an awful lot of it from China, and then we don't get the green jobs we've been promising everybody.
And it's really interesting that Draghi, of all people, is saying it, because he is an instrumental part of the European project. The net zero ambition has become fundamental to the European project. The European economies are way ahead of other economies in decarbonising.
Yeah.
Is this a likely, probable big change, or is this just a voice in the wilderness?
Well, at the moment it's a voice in the wilderness, but it's an official voice in the wilderness with all the panoply of publication by the EU and a whole series of recommendations to the EU. But von der Leyen's going to find it difficult, because she announced the big European Green Deal, which intensified all this, and said it was their man on the moon moment. And it now turns out they can't afford the satellite, and it hasn't got the energy to get it there. And so there needs to be a desperately big rethink. And German industry is really suffering. Germany, the great motor, the success story, relatively more prosperous than the rest of the EU, is in almost permanent recession at the moment. It's totally dependent for success on its automotive industry. And it hasn't done the transition to battery cars. So they are in a really, really big bind. And Draghi doesn't beat about the bush. He says that the gap with America is huge and growing all the time. And it's been particularly big, the growth rate, since 2000.
And the EU's response so far seems to have been proposing to spend an enormous amount of money, which would be following the lines of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States.
Yeah.
Is this a realistic prospect, that there could be investment, that the European Union come together and go into the bond markets and raise billions into the trillions of euros to fund a transformation to a green economy?
Yeah, this is trillions of euros where they would need quite a lot from the private sector. And yes, he is talking about another big issue of bonds. As we know, there's been an 800 billion programme of bond issuing at the EU level. The Germans are saying no more. They're saying this is far too much. And thank heavens Britain isn't part of that, because that would mean our state debt was going up at a colossal rate of knots, because we'd have to meet our part of that debt. So no, I don't think it's very realistic to get a lot of state debt. So then they will turn to try and get private debt. And he rightly is very critical of the EU. It says it doesn't have proper financial markets and financial institutions on the scale of America. The capital is in America. These projects are in Europe. They may not have a very good rate of return. It's not great odds of getting the money.
And America has reduced its carbon emissions actually by fracking more than by anything else.
Yeah.
It hasn't moved away from using traditional carbon sources of energy.
And it hasn't put itself into a legal bind with a legally set out target. And Draghi makes that very clear. He says, you know, the EU is prisoner of its own targets. America has guidelines, and they're not nearly as onerous as the ones set for Europe. And of course, China doesn't have anything, and China is the main industrial competitor, and China is cleaning up with coal to power it.
Well, there's a wonderful irony, isn't there, that all these extremely environmental batteries getting into electric cars are produced using coal-powered electricity in China, and then they come over here and we pretend it's much cleaner than using oil and gas from our own resources. One of the other...
Well, and of course, if you plug an electric car in tonight, they'll already be using all the renewable power, so they'll have to burn some more gas in a power station. So how does that help?
It doesn't seem to me to help at all. And you've also got the question of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, this worries me particularly because this seems to me to be classic protectionism. And protectionism always has to find an excuse to justify it. Protecting an industry or protecting a target. But this will just make European economies and the UK economy less efficient, won't it? Because we will be much higher cost than anywhere else. Yeah,
it makes us all worse off. It's a tax on consumers because we will have to pay more for our products. And this is the cruel dilemma that Draghi identifies. I mean, you might sell more electric cars, problematic though they are, if you sold them at Chinese car prices. But the EU has decided it's got to put a big tariff on them. America's put an even bigger tariff on because it will completely wreck the domestic car industry otherwise much more quickly.
And the domestic car industry needs to remain on the petrol engine, essentially. And the Italians have called for a delay in the move away.
How right they are. Because the public won't go with this at the moment.
Isn't this the fundamental point, that ultimately people will not vote to be cold and poor, and that they've been lied to, really, about this? They've thought that going green was free or even economically beneficial.
That's right.
And we're now increasingly seeing, with the EU underperforming GDP per capita growth in the US now for a decade, that there is no free, low-carbon economy.
No, it's very costly. And now we're beginning to learn the costs. I mean, as we know in this country, Labour has committed us to intensification of these policies without knowing the cost. And now Miliband has had to write a letter to National Grid saying, one, how do I do this? Can I do it? And two, how much does it cost? Well, you should do all that thinking before you impose it on people. And offering people £300 an unspecified date off their bills when it's actually going to get quite a lot dearer is really bad.
And that's where there's been a lot of dishonesty in pretending that renewables are cheap when they are only cheap if you don't account for the gas that you've got on standby for when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine.
Exactly right. And that is their big problem. And we are paying extra taxes or levies on our bill in order to subsidise the early rounds of renewables.